Now we're finally gonna find out what has happened to Hassan all those years in Afghanistan. So get your tissues and let's read. Chapter 15. 3 hours after my flight landed in Peshawar, I was sitting on shredded upholstery in the backseat of a smoke-filled taxi cab. My driver, a chain-smoking, sweaty little man who introduced himself as Ghulam, drove nonchalantly and recklessly, averting collisions by the thinnest of margins, all without so much as a pause in the incessant stream of words spewing from his mouth. Terrible what is happening in your country, Yar. Afghani people and Pakistani people, they are like brothers. I tell you, Muslims have to help Muslims, so... I tuned him out, switched to a polite nodding mode. I remembered Peshawar pretty well from the few months Baba and I had spent there in 1981. We were heading west now on Jamrud Road, past the cantonment and its lavish, high-walled homes. The bustle of the city blurring past me reminded me of a busier, more crowded version of the Kabul I knew, particularly the Kuche Morgha, chicken bazaar, where Hassan and I used to buy chutney-dipped potatoes and cherry water. The streets were clogged with bicycle riders, milling pedestrians, and rickshaws popping blue smoke, all weaving through a maze of narrow lanes and alleys. Bearded vendors draped in thin blankets sold animal skin lampshades, carpets, embroidered shawls, and copper goods from rows of small, tightly jammed stalls. The city was bursting with sounds. The shouts of vendors rang in my ears, mingled with the blare of Hindi music, the sputtering of rickshaws, and the jingling bells of horse-drawn carts. Rich scents, both pleasant and not so pleasant, drifted to me through the passenger window. The spicy aroma of pakora and the nihari Baba had loved so much blended with the sting of diesel fumes, the stench of rot, garbage, and feces. A little past the red brick buildings of Peshawar University, we entered an area my garrulous driver referred to as Afghan Town. I saw sweet shops and carpet vendors, kebab stalls, kids with dirt-caked hands selling cigarettes, tiny restaurants, maps of Afghanistan painted on their windows, all interlaced with backstreet aid agencies. Many of your brothers in this area, Yar. They're opening businesses, but most of them are very poor. He tisked his tongue and sighed. Anyway, we're getting close now. I thought about the last time I had seen Rahim Khan in 1981. He had come to say goodbye the night Baba and I fled Kabul. I remember Baba and him embracing in the foyer, crying softly. When Baba and I arrived in the US, he and Rahim Khan kept in touch. They would speak 4 or 5 times a year, and sometimes Baba would pass me the receiver. The last time I had spoken to Rahim Khan had been shortly after Baba's death. The news had reached Kabul and he had called. We'd only spoken for a few minutes and lost the connection. The driver pulled up to a narrow building at a busy corner where 2 winding streets intersected. I paid the driver, took my lone suitcase, and walked up to the intricately carved door. The building had wooden balconies with open shutters. From many of them, laundry was hanging to dry in the sun. I walked up the creaky stairs to the second floors, down a dim hallway to the last door on the right, checked the address on the piece of stationery paper in my palm, knocked. Then, a thing made of skin and bones, pretending to be Rahim Khan, opened the door. A creative writing teacher at San Jose State used to say about cliches, avoid them like the plague. Then he'd laugh at his own joke. The class laughed along with him, but I always thought cliches got a bum rap, because often they're dead on. But the aptness of the cliched saying is overshadowed by the nature of the saying as a cliche. For example, the elephant in the room saying. Nothing could more correctly describe the initial moments of my reunion with Rahim Khan. We sat on a wispy mattress set along the wall, across the window overlooking the noisy street below. Sunlight slanted in and cast a triangle wedge of light onto the Afghan rug on the floor. 2 folding chairs rested against one wall, and a small copper samovar sat in the opposite corner. I poured us tea from it. How did you find me? I asked. It's not difficult to find people in America. I bought a map of the US and called up information for cities in Northern California. He said, it's wonderfully strange to see you as a grown man. I smiled and dropped 3 sugar cubes in my tea. He liked his black and bitter, I remembered. Baba didn't get the chance to tell you, but I got married 15 years ago. The truth was, by then, the cancer in Baba's brain had made him forgetful, negligent. You are married? To whom? Her name is Soraya Taheri. I thought of her back home, worrying about me. I was glad she wasn't alone. Taheri, whose daughter is she? I told him. His eyes brightened. Oh yes, I remember now. Oh yes, I remember now. Isn't General Taheri married to Sharif Jan's sister? What was her name? Jamila Jan. Bali, he said, smiling. I knew Sharif Jan in Kabul, long time ago, before he moved to America. He's been working with the INS for years, handles a lot of Afghan cases. Hey, he sighed. Do you and Soraya Jan have children? Nay. Oh. He slurped his tea and didn't ask more. Rahim Khan had always been one of the most instinctive people I've ever met. I told him a lot about Baba, his job, the flea market, and how at the end he'd died happy. I told him about my schooling, my books, 4 published novels to my credit now. He smiled at this, said he had never had any doubt. I told him I had written short stories in the leather-bound notebook he'd given me, but he didn't remember the notebook. The conversation inevitably turned to the Taliban. Is it as bad as I hear? I said. Nay, it's worse, much worse, he said. They don't let you be human. He pointed to the scar above his right eye, cutting a crooked path through his bushy eyebrow. I was at a soccer game in Ghazi Stadium in 1998, Kabul against Mazar Sharif, I think. And by the way, the players weren't allowed to wear shorts. Indecent exposure, I guess. He gave a tired laugh. Anyway, Kabul scored a goal and the man next to me cheered loudly. Suddenly, this young bearded fella who was patrolling the aisles, 18 years old at most by the look of him, he walked up to me and struck me in the forehead with the butt of his Kalashnikov. Do that again and I'll cut your tongue, you old donkey, he said. Rahim Khan rubbed the scar with a gnarled finger. I was old enough to be his grandfather and I was sitting there, blood gushing down my face, apologizing to that son of a dog. I poured him more tea. Rahim Khan talked some more. Much of it I knew already, some not. He told me that, as arranged between Baba and him, he had lived in Baba's house since 1981. This I knew about. Baba had sold the house to Rahim Khan shortly before he and I fled Kabul. The way Baba had seen it those days, Afghanistan's trouble were only a temporary interruption of our way of life. The days of parties at the Wazir Akbar Khan house and picnics in Paghman would surely return. So he'd given the house to Rahim Khan to keep watch over until that day. Rahim Khan told me how when the Northern Alliance took over Kabul between 1992 and 1996, different factions claimed different parts of Kabul. If you went from Shahr-e-No section to Kart Parwan to buy a carpet, you risked getting shot by a sniper or getting blown up by a rocket. If you got past all the checkpoints, that was. You particularly needed a visa to go from one neighborhood to the other, so people just stayed put, prayed the next rocket wouldn't hit their home. He told me how people knocked holes in the walls of their homes so they could bypass the dangerous streets and would move down the block from hole to hole. In other parts, people moved about in underground tunnels. Why didn't you leave? I said. Kabul was my home. It still is. He snickered. Remember the streets that went from your house to the Qishla, the military barracks next to Istiqlal School? Yes. It was a shortcut to school. I remember the day Hassan and I crossed it and the soldiers had teased Hassan about his mother. Hassan had cried in the cinema later and I'd put an arm around him. When the Taliban rolled in and kicked the alliance out of Kabul, I actually danced on that street, Rahim Khan said. And believe me, I wasn't alone. People were celebrating at Chaman, at Deh Mazang, greeting the Taliban in the streets, climbing their tanks and posing for pictures with them. People were so tired of the constant fighting, tired of the rockets, the gunfire, the explosions, tired of watching Gulabuddin and his cohorts firing on anything that moved. The alliance did more damage to Kabul than the Shoravi. They destroyed your father's orphanage. Did you know that? Why? I said. Why would they destroy an orphanage? I remembered sitting behind Baba the day they opened the orphanage. The wind had knocked off his caracal hat and everyone had laughed, then stood and clapped when he delivered his speech. And now it was just another pile of rubble, all the money Baba had spent, all those nights he'd sweated over the blueprints, all the visits to the construction site to make sure every brick, every beam, and every block was laid just right. Collateral damage, Rahim Khan said. You don't want to know, Amir Jan, what it was like sifting through the rubbles of the orphanage. There were body parts of children. So when the Taliban came, they were heroes, Rahim Khan said. Peace at last. Yes, hope is a strange thing. Peace at last. But at what price? A violent coughing fit gripped Rahim Khan and rocked his gaunt body back and forth. When he spat into his handkerchief, it immediately stained red. I thought that was as good a time as any to address the elephant sweating with us in the tiny room. How are you? I asked. I mean, really, how are you? Dying, actually, he said in a gargling voice. Another round of coughing, more blood on the handkerchief. He wiped his mouth, blotted his sweaty brow from one wasted temple to the other with his sleeve, and gave me a quick glance. When he nodded, I knew he had read the next question in my face. Not long, he breathed. How long? He shrugged, coughed again. I don't think I'll see the end of the summer, he said. Let me take you home with me. I can find you a good doctor. They're coming up with new treatments all the time. There are new drugs and experimental treatments. We could enroll you in one. I was rambling and I knew it. But it was better than crying, which I was probably going to do anyway. He let out a chuff of laughter, revealed missing lower incisors. It was the most tired laughter I'd ever heard. I see America has infused you with the optimism that has made her so great. That's very good. We are a melancholic people, we Afghans, aren't we? We often wallow too much in ghamkhori and self-pity. We give in to loss, to suffering, accept it as a fact of life, even see it as necessary. Zendegi migzare, we say, life goes on, but I am not surrendering to fate here. I'm being pragmatic. I have seen several good doctors here and they have given the same answer. I trust them and believe them. There is such a thing as God's will. There's only what you do and what you don't do, I said. Rahim Khan laughed. You sounded like your father just now. I miss him so much. But it is God's will, Amir Jan. It really is. He paused. Besides, there is another reason I asked you to come here. I wanted to see you before I go, yes, but something else too. Anything. You know, all those years I lived in your father's house after you left? Yes, I wasn't alone for all of them. Hassan lived there with me. Hassan, I said, when was the last time I had spoken his name? Those thorny old barbs of guilt bore into me once more, as if speaking his name had broken a spell, set them free to torment me anew. Suddenly, the air in Rahim Khan's little flat was too thick, too hot, too rich with the smell of the street. I thought about writing you and telling you before, but I wasn't sure you wanted to know. Was I wrong? The truth was no, the lie was yes. I settled for something in between. I don't know. He coughed another patch of blood into the handkerchief. When he bent his head to spit, I saw honey-crusted sores on his scalp. I brought you here because I'm going to ask something of you. I'm going to ask you to do something for me. But before I do, I want to tell you about Hassan. Do you understand? Yes, I murmured. I want to tell you about him. I want to tell you everything. You will listen? I nodded. Then Rahim Khan sipped some more tea, rested his head against the wall, and spoke. Chapter 16. There were a lot of reasons why I went to Hazarajat to find Hassan in 1986. The biggest one, Allah forgive me, was that I was lonely. By then, most of my friends and relatives had either been killed or had escaped the country to Pakistan or Iran. I barely knew anyone in Kabul anymore, the city where I had lived my entire life. Everybody had fled. I would take a walk in the Karta Parwan section, where the melon vendors used to hang out in the old days. You remember that spot? And I wouldn't recognize anyone there. No one to greet, no one to sit down with for chai, no one to share stories with, just Rusi soldiers patrolling the streets. So eventually I stopped going out to the city. I would spend my days in your father's house, up in the study, reading your mother's old books, listening to the news, watching the communist propaganda on television. Then I would pray namaz, cook something, eat, read some more, pray again, and go to bed. I would rise in the morning, pray, do it all over again. And with my arthritis, it was getting harder for me to maintain the house. My knees and back were always aching. I would get up in the morning and it would take me at least an hour to shake the stiffness from my joints, especially in the wintertime. I did not want to let your father's house go to rot. We had all had many good times in that house, so many memories, Amirjan. It was not right. Your father had designed that house himself. It had meant so much to him, and besides, I had promised him I would care for it when he and you left for Pakistan. Now it was just me and the house, and I did my best. I tried to water the trees every few days, cut the lawn, tend to the flowers, fix things that needed fixing, but even then, I was not a young man anymore. But even so, I might have been able to manage, at least for a while longer. But when news of your father's death reached me, for the first time, I felt a terrible loneliness in that house, an unbearable emptiness. So one day I filled up the Buick and drove up to Hazarajat. I remember that after Ali dismissed himself from the house, your father told me he and Hassan had moved to a small village just outside Bamiyan. Ali had a cousin there, as I recalled. I had no idea if Hassan would still be there, if anyone would even know of him and his whereabouts. After all, it had been 10 years since Ali and Hassan had left your father's house. Hassan would have been a grown man in 1986, 22, 23 years old, if he was even alive. That is, the Shorabi, may they rot in hell for what they did to our Watan, killed so many of our young men. I don't have to tell you that. But with the grace of God, I found him there. It took very little searching. All I had to do was ask a few questions in Bamiyan, and people pointed me to his village. I do not even recall its name or whether it even had one, but I remember it was a scorching summer day, and I was driving up a rotted dirt road. Nothing on either side but sun-baked bushes, gnarled spiny tree trunks, and dried grass like pale straw. I passed a dead donkey rotting on the side of the road, and then I turned a corner and, right in the middle of that barren land, I saw a cluster of mud houses. Beyond them, nothing but broad sky and mountains like jagged teeth. The people in Bamiyan had told me I would find him easily. He lived in the only house in the village that had a walled garden. The mud wall, short and pocked with holes, enclosed the tiny house, which was really not much more than a glorified hut. Barefoot children were playing on the street, kicking a ragged tennis ball with a stick, and they stared when I pulled up and killed the engine. I knocked on the wooden door and stepped through into a yard that had very little in it, save for a patch of a strawberry patch and a bare lemon tree. There was a tandoor in the corner in the shadow of an acacia tree, and I saw a man squatting beside it. He was placing dough on a large wooden spatula and slapping it against the walls of the tandoor. He dropped the dough when he saw me. I had to make him stop kissing my hands. "Let me look at you," I said. He stepped away. He was so tall now. I stood on my toes and still just came up to his chin. The Bamiyan sun had toughened his skin and turned it several shades darker than I remembered, and he had lost a few of his front teeth. There were sparse strands of hair on his chin. Other than that, he had those same narrow green eyes, that scar on his upper lip, that round face, that affable smile. You would have recognized him, Amirjan, I am sure of it. We went inside. There was a young, light-skinned Hazara woman sewing a shawl in a corner of the room. She was visibly expecting. "This is my wife, Rahim Khan," Hassan said proudly. "Her name is Farzana Jan." She was a shy woman, so courteous she spoke in a voice barely higher than a whisper, and she would not raise her pretty hazel eyes to meet my gaze. But the way she was looking at Hassan, he might as well have been sitting on the throne at the Arg, the castle. "When is the baby coming?" I said after we all settled around the adobe room. There was nothing in the room, just a frayed rug, a few dishes, a pair of mattresses, and a lantern. "Inshallah this winter," Hassan said. "I am praying for a boy to carry on my father's name." "Speaking of Ali, where is he?" Hassan dropped his gaze. He told me that Ali and his cousin, who had owned the house, had been killed by a landmine 2 years before, just outside of Bamiyan. A landmine. Is there a more Afghan way of dying, Amirjan? And for some crazy reason, I became absolutely certain that it had been Ali's right leg, his twisted polio leg that had finally betrayed him and stepped onto that landmine. I was deeply saddened to hear Ali had died. Your father and I grew up together, as you know, and Ali had been with him as long as I could remember. I remember when we were all little, the year Ali got polio and almost died. Your father would walk around the house all day crying. Farzana made us shorva with beans, turnip, and potatoes. We washed our hands and dipped fresh naan from the tandoor into the shorva. It was the best meal I had had in months. It was then that I asked Hassan to move to Kabul with me. I told him about the house, how I could not care for it by myself anymore. I told him I would pay him well, that he and his khanum would be comfortable. They looked to each other and did not say anything. Later, after we had washed our hands and Farzana had served us grapes, Hassan said the village was his home now. He and Farzana had made a life for themselves there. And Bamiyan is close. We know people there. Forgive me, Rahim Khan. I pray you understand. Of course, I said. You have nothing to apologize for, I understand. It was midway through tea after shorba that Hassan asked about you. I told him you were in America, but that I did not know much more. Hassan had so many questions about you. Had you married? Did you have children? How tall were you? Did you still fly kites and go to the cinema? Were you happy? He said he had befriended an old Farsi teacher in Bamiyan who had taught him to read and write. If he wrote you a letter, would I pass it on to you? And did I think you would write back? I told him what I knew of you from the few phone conversations I had had with your father, but mostly I did not know how to answer him. Then he asked me about your father. When I told him, Hassan buried his face in his hands and broke into tears. He wept like a child for the rest of that night. They insisted that I spend the night there. Farzana fixed a cot for me and left me a glass of well water in case I got thirsty. All night I heard her whispering to Hassan and heard him sobbing. In the morning, Hassan told me he and Farzana had decided to move to Kabul with me. I should not have come here, I said. You were right, Hassan John. You have a zendegi, a life here. It was presumptuous of me to just show up and ask you to drop everything. It is me who needs to be forgiven. We don't have that much to drop, Rahim Khan, Hassan said. His eyes were still red and puffy. We'll go with you. We'll help you take care of the house. Are you absolutely sure? He nodded and dropped his head. Agha Sahib was like my second father. God give him peace. They piled their things in the center of a few worn rags and tied the corners together. We loaded the bundle into the buick. Hassan stood in the threshold of the house and held the Quran as we all kissed it and passed under it. Then we left for Kabul. I remember as I was pulling away, Hassan turned to take a last look at their home. When we got to Kabul, I discovered that Hassan had no intention of moving into the house. But all these rooms are empty, Hassan John. No one is going to live in them, I said. But he would not. He said it was a matter of ihtiram, a matter of respect. He and Farzana moved their things into the hut in the backyard where he was born. I pleaded for them to move into one of the guest bedrooms upstairs, but Hassan would hear nothing of it. What will Amir Agha think? He said to me. What will he think when he comes back to Kabul after the war and finds that I have assumed his place in the house? Then, in mourning for your father, Hassan wore black for the next 40 days. I did not want them to, but the two of them did all the cooking, all the cleaning. Hassan tended to the flowers in the garden, soaked the roots, picked off yellowing leaves, and planted rose bushes. He painted the walls. In the house, he swept rooms no one had slept in for years, and cleaned bathrooms no one had bathed in, like he was preparing the house for someone's return. Do you remember the wall behind the row of corn your father had planted, Amir Jan? What did you and Hassan call it? The wall of ailing corn? A rocket destroyed a whole section of that wall in the middle of the night early that fall. Hassan rebuilt the wall with his own hands, brick by brick, until it stood whole again. I do not know what I would have done if he had not been there. Then, late that fall, Farzana gave birth to a stillborn baby girl. Hassan kissed the baby's lifeless face, and we buried her in the backyard near the sweetbriar bushes. We covered the little mound with leaves from the poplar trees. I said a prayer for her. Farzana stayed in the hut all day and wailed. It is a heartbreaking sound, Amir Jan, the wailing of a mother. I pray to Allah you never hear it. Outside the walls of the house there was a war raging, but the three of us in your father's house, we made our own little heaven from it. My vision started going by the late 1980s, so I had Hassan read me your mother's books. We would sit in the foyer by the stove and Hassan would read me from Masnavi or Khayyam as Farzana cooked in the kitchen. And every morning Hassan placed a flower on the little mound by the sweetbriar bushes. In early 1990, Farzana became pregnant again. It was that same year, in the middle of the summer, that a woman covered in a sky blue burqa knocked on the front gates one morning. When I walked up to the gates, she was swaying on her feet, like she was too weak to even stand. I asked her what she wanted, but she would not answer. "Who are you?" I said, but she just collapsed right there in the driveway. I yelled for Hassan and he helped me carry her into the house to the living room. We lay her on the sofa and took off her burqa. Beneath it, we found a toothless woman with a stringy graying hair and sores on her arms. She looked like she had not eaten for days, but the worst of it by far was her face. Someone had taken a knife to it and... Amirjan, the slashes cut this way and that way. One of the cuts went from the cheekbone to hairline and it had not spared her left eye on the way. It was grotesque. I patted her brow with a wet cloth and she opened her eye. "Where is Hassan?" she whispered. "I'm right here," Hassan said. He took her hand and squeezed it. Her good eye rolled to him. "I have walked long and far to see if you are as beautiful in flesh as you are in my dreams, and you are, even more." She pulled his hand to his scarred face. "Smile for me, please." Hassan did, and the old woman wept. "You smiled coming out of me. Did anyone ever tell you? And I wouldn't even hold you. Allah forgive me, I wouldn't even hold you." None of us had seen Sanubar since she had eloped with a band of singers and dancers in 1964, just after she had given birth to Hassan. You never saw her, Amir, but in her youth, she was a vision. She had a dimpled smile and a walk that drove men crazy. No one who passed her on the street, be it a man or woman, could look at her only once. And now... Hassan dropped her hand and bolted out of the house. I went after him, but he was too fast. I saw him running up the hill where you two used to play, his feet kicking up plumes of dust. I let him go. I sat with Sanubar all day as the sky went from bright blue to purple. Hassan still had not come back when the night fell and moonlight bathed the clouds. Sanubar cried that coming back had been a mistake, maybe even a worse one than leaving, but I made her stay. Hassan would return, I knew. He came back the next morning, looking tired and weary, like he had not slept all night. He took Sanubar's hand in both of his and told her she could cry if she wanted to, but she needn't. She was home now, he said, home with her family. He touched the scar on her face and ran his hand through her hair. Hassan and Farzana nursed her back to health. They fed her and washed her clothes. I gave her one of the guest rooms upstairs. Sometimes I would look out the window into the yard and watch Hassan and his mother kneeling together, picking tomatoes or trimming a rose bush, talking. They were catching up on all those lost years, I suppose. As far as I know, he never asked where she had been or why she had left, and she never told. I guess some stories do not need telling. It was Sanubar who delivered Hassan's son that winter of 1990. It had not started snowing yet, but the winter winds were blowing through the yards, bending the flower beds and rustling the leaves. I remember Sanubar came out of the hut holding her grandson, had him wrapped in a wool blanket. She stood beaming under a dull gray sky, tears streaming down her cheeks, the needle-cold wind blowing her hair and clutching that baby in her arms like she never wanted to let go. Not this time. She handed him to Hassan and he handed him to me, and I sang the prayer of Ayatul Kursi in that little boy's ear. They named him Sohrab, after Hassan's favorite hero from the Shahnameh, as you know, Amirjan. He was a beautiful little boy, sweet as sugar, and had the same temperaments as his father. You should have seen Sanubar with that baby, Amirjan. He became the center of her existence. She sewed clothes for him, built him toys from scraps of woods, rags, and dried grass. When he caught a fever, she stayed up all night and fasted for 3 days. She burned asfand for him on a skillet to cast out Nazr, the evil eye. By the time Sohrab was 2, he was calling her Sasa. The two of them were inseparable. She lived to see him turn 4, and then, one morning, she just did not wake up. She looked calm, at peace, like she did not mind dying now. We buried her in the cemetery on the hill, the one by the pomegranate tree. and I said a prayer for her too. The loss was hard on Hassan. It always hurts more to have and lose than to not have in the first place. But it was even harder on little Sohrab. He kept walking around the house looking for Sasa, but you know how children are. They forget so quickly. By then, that would have been 1995, the Shorabi were defeated and long gone, and Kabul belonged to Mas'ud, Rabbani, and Mujahideen. The infighting between the factions were fierce, and no one knew if they would live to see the end of the day. Our ears became accustomed to the whistle of falling shells, the rumble of gunfire, our eyes familiar with the sight of men digging bodies out of piles of rubble. Kabul in those days, Amirjan, was as close as you could get to the proverbial hell on earth. Allah was kind to us though. The Wazir Akbar Khan area was not attacked as much, so we did not have it as bad as some of the other neighborhoods. On those days when the rocket fire eased up a bit and the gunfire was light, Hassan would take Sohrab to the zoo to see Marjan the lion, or to the cinema. Hassan taught him how to shoot the slingshot, and later, by the time he was 8, Sohrab had become deadly with that thing. He could stand on the terrace and hit a pine cone propped on a pail halfway across the yard. Hassan taught him to read and write. His son was not going to grow up illiterate like he had. I grew very attached to that little boy. I had seen him take his first step, heard him utter his first word. I bought children's books for Sohrab from the bookstore by Cinema Park. They have destroyed that too now, and Sohrab read them as quickly as I could get them to him. He reminded me of you, how you loved to read when you were little, Amirjan. Sometimes I read to him at night, played riddles with him, taught him card tricks. I miss him terribly. In the wintertime, Hassan took his son kite running. There were not nearly as many kite tournaments as in the old days. No one felt safe outside for too long, but there were still a few scattered tournaments. Hassan would prop Sohrab on his shoulders and they would go trotting through the streets, running kites, climbing trees where kites had dropped. You remember, Amirjan, what a good kite runner Hassan was? He was still as good. At the end of the winter, Hassan and Sohrab would hang the kites they had run all winter on the walls of the main hallway. They would put them up like paintings. I told you how we all celebrated in 1996 when the Taliban rolled in and put an end to the daily fighting. I remember coming home that night and finding Hassan in the kitchen, listening to the radio. He had a sober look in his eyes. I asked him what was wrong, and he just shook his head. God help us the Hazaras now, Rahim Khan Sahib, he said. The war is over, Hassan, I said. There's going to be peace, inshallah, and happiness and calm. No more rockets, no more killing, no more funerals. But he just turned off the radio and asked if he could get me anything before he went to bed. A few weeks later, the Taliban banned kite fighting, and 2 years later, in 1998, they massacred the Hazaras in Mazar-e-Sharif. Just thinking about how many lives have been lost in Middle East, it's just really upsetting and unsettling. But let's continue reading. We still don't know what has happened to Hassan. Chapter 17. Rahim Khan slowly uncrossed his legs and leaned against the bare wall in the very deliberate way of a man whose every movement triggers spikes of pain. Outside, a donkey was braying and someone was shouting something in Urdu. The sun was beginning to set, glittering red through the cracks between the ramshackle buildings. It hit me again, the enormity of what I had done that winter and that following summer. The names rang in my head: Hassan, Sohrab, Ali, Farzaneh, and Sanubar. Hearing Rahim Khan speak Ali's name was like finding an old dusty music box that hadn't been opened in years. The melody began to play immediately. Who did you eat today, Babalu? Who did you eat, you slunt-eyed Babalu? I tried to conjure Ali's frozen face to really see his tranquil eyes. But time can be a greedy thing. Sometimes it steals all the details for itself. Is Hassan still in that house now? I asked. Rahim Khan raised a teacup to his parched lips and took a sip. He then fished an envelope from the breast pocket of his vest and handed it to me. For you. I tore the sealed envelope. Inside, I found a Polaroid photograph and a folded letter. I stared at the photograph for a full minute. A tall man, dressed in a white turban and a green-striped chapon, stood with a little boy in front of a set of wrought iron gates. Sunlight slanted in from the left, casting a shadow on half of his round face. He was squinting and smiling at the camera, showing a pair of missing front teeth. Even in this blurry Polaroid, the man in the chapon exuded a sense of self-assurance, of ease. It was in the way he stood, his feet slightly apart, his arms comfortably crossed on his chest, his head tilted a little toward the sun. Mostly it was the way he smiled. Looking at a photo, one might have concluded that this was a man who thought the world had been good to him. Rahim Khan was right. I would have recognized him if I had bumped into him on the street. The little boy stood barefoot, one arm wrapped around the man's thigh, his shaved head resting against his father's hip. He too was grinning and squinting. I unfolded the letter. It was written in Farsi. No dots were omitted, no crosses forgotten, no words blurred together. The handwriting was almost childlike in its neatness. I began to read. In the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful. Amir Agha, with my deepest respects, Farzana Jan, Sohrab and I pray that this latest letter finds you in good health and in the light of Allah's good graces. Please offer my warmest thanks to Rahim Khan Sahib for carrying it to you. I am hopeful that one day I will hold one of your letters in my hands and read of your life in America. Perhaps a photograph of you will grace our eyes. I have told much about you to Farzana Jan and Sohrab, about us growing up together and playing games and running in the streets. They laugh at the stories of all the mischief you and I used to cause. Amir Agha, alas, the Afghanistan of our youth is long dead. Kindness is gone from the land and you cannot escape the killings. Always the killings. In Kabul, fear is everywhere, in the streets, in the stadium, in the markets. It is a part of our lives here, Amir Agha. The savages who rule our Vatan don't care about human decency. The other day, I accompanied Farzana Jan to the bazaar to buy some potatoes and naan. She asked the vendor how much the potatoes cost, but he did not hear her. I think he had a deaf ear. So she asked louder, and suddenly a young Talib ran over and hit her on the thighs with his wooden stick. He struck her so hard she fell down. He was screaming at her and cursing and saying the Ministry of Vice and Virtue does not allow women to speak loudly. She had a large purple bruise on her leg for days, but what could I do except stand and watch my wife get beaten? If I fought, that dog would have surely put a bullet in me, and gladly. Then what would happen to my Sohrab? The streets are full enough already of hungry orphans, and every day I thank Allah that I am alive, not because I fear death, but because my wife has a husband and my son is not an orphan. I wish you could see Sohrab. He's a good boy. Rahim Khan Sahib and I have taught him to read and write so he does not grow up stupid like his father. And he can shoot with that slingshot. I take Sohrab around Kabul sometimes and buy him candy. There's still a monkey man in Shahrino, and if we run into him, I pay him to make his monkey dance for Sohrab. You should see how he laughs. The two of us often walk up to the cemetery on the hill. Do you remember how we used to sit under the pomegranate tree there and read from the Shahnameh? The droughts have dried the hill, and the tree hasn't borne fruit in years, but Sohrab and I still sit under its shade, and I read to him from the Shahnameh. It is not necessary to tell you that his favorite part is the one with his namesake, Rostam and Sohrab. Soon he will be able to read from the book himself. I am a very proud and very lucky father. Amir Agha, Rahim Khan Sahib is quite ill. He coughs all day and I see blood on his sleeve when he wipes his mouth. He has lost much weight and I wish he would eat a little of shorba and rice that Farzana Jan cooks for him. But he only takes a bite or two, and even that I think is out of courtesy to Farzana Jan. I am so worried about this dear man. I pray for him every day. He's leaving for Pakistan in a few days to consult some doctors there, and inshallah he will return with good news. But in my heart I fear for him. Farzana Jan and I have told little Sohrab that Rahim Khan Sahib is going to be well. What can we do? He is only 10 and he adores Rahim Khan Sahib. They have grown so close to each other. Rahim Khan Sahib used to take him to the bazaar for balloons and biscuits, but he's too weak for that now. I have been dreaming a lot lately, Amir Agha. Some of them are nightmares, like hanged corpses rotting in the soccer fields with blood-red grass. I wake up from those short of breath and sweaty. Mostly though, I dream of good things and praise Allah for that. I dream that Rahim Khan Sahib will be well. I dream that my son will grow up to be a good person, a free person and an important person. I dream that lale flowers will bloom in the streets of Kabul again, and robab music will play in the samovar houses and kites will fly in the skies. And I dream that someday you will return to Kabul to revisit the land of our childhood. If you do, you will find an old faithful friend waiting for you. May Allah be with you always, Hassan. I read the letter twice, folded the note and looked at the photograph for another minute. I pocketed both. How is he? I asked. That letter was written 6 months ago, a few days before I left for Peshawar, Rahim Khan said. I took the Polaroid the day before I left. A month after I arrived in Peshawar, I received a telephone call from one of my neighbors in Kabul. He told me this story. Soon after I took my leave, a rumor spread that a Hazara family was living alone in the big house in Bazir Akbar Khan, or so the Taliban claim. A pair of Talib officials came to investigate and interrogate Hassan. They accused him of lying when Hassan told them he was living with me, even though many of the neighbors, including the one who called me, supported Hassan's story. The Talib said he was a liar and a thief like all Hazaras and ordered him to get his family out of the house by sundown. Hassan protested, but my neighbor said the Talibs were looking at the big house like, how did you say it? Yes, like wolves looking at a flock of sheep. They told Hassan they would be moving in to supposedly keep it safe until I return. Hassan protested again. So they took him to the street. No, and ordered him to kneel. No, God no, and shot him in the back of the head. No, Farzana came screaming and attacked them. No, shot her too, self-defense, they claimed later. But all I could manage was to whisper, no, 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 over and over again. I kept thinking of that day in 1974 in the hospital room, just after Hassan's hair lip surgery. Baba, Rahim Khan, Ali and I huddled around Hassan's bed, watched him examine his new lip in the handheld mirror. Now everyone in that room was either dead or dying, except for me. Then I saw something else. A man dressed in a herringbone vest pressing the muzzle of his Kalashnikov to the back of Hassan's head. The blast echoes through the streets of my father's house. Hassan slumps to the asphalt, his life of unrequited loyalty drifting from him like the wind-blown kites he used to chase. The Taliban moved into the house, Rahim Khan said. The pretext was that they had evicted the trespasser. Hassan's and Farzana's murders were dismissed as a case of self-defense. No one said a word about it. Most of it was fear of the Taliban, I think. But no one was going to risk anything for a pair of Hazara servants. What did they do to Sohrab? I asked. I felt tired, drained. A coughing fit gripped Rahim Khan and went on for a long time. When he finally looked up, his face was flushed and his eyes bloodshot. I heard he's in an orphanage somewhere in Kartase, Amirjan. Then he was coughing again. When he stopped, he looked older than a few moments before, like he was aging with each coughing fit. Amirjan, I summoned you here because I wanted to see you before I die. But that's not all. I said nothing. I think I already knew what he was going to say. I want you to go to Kabul. I want you to bring Sohrab here, he said. I struggled to find the right words. I'd barely had time to deal with the fact that Hassan was dead. Please hear me. I know an American pair here in Peshawar. A husband and wife named Thomas and Betty Caldwell. They are Christians and they run a small charity organization that they manage with private donations. Mostly they house and feed Afghan children who had lost their parents. I have seen the place. It's clean and safe. The children are well cared for and Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell are kind people. They have already told me that Sohrab would be welcome to their home and... Rahim Khan, you can't be serious. Children are fragile, Amirjan. Kabul is already full of broken children and I don't want Sohrab to become another. Rahim Khan, I don't want to go to Kabul. I can't, I said. Sohrab is a gifted little boy. We can give him a new life here. New hope with people who would love him. Thomas Agha is a good man and Betty Khanum is so kind. You should see how she treats those orphans. Why me? Why can't you pay someone here to go? I'll pay for it if it's a matter of money. It isn't about money, Amir, Rahim Khan roared. I am a dying man and I will not be insulted. It has never been about money with me, you know that. And why you? I think we both know why it has to be you, don't we? I didn't want to understand that comment, but I did. I understood it all too well. I have a wife in America, a home, a career, and a family. Kabul is a dangerous place, you know that, and you'd have me risk everything for... I stopped. You know, Rahim Khan said, one time when you weren't around, your father and I were talking, and you know how he always worried about you in those days. I remember he said to me, Rahim, a boy who won't stand up for himself becomes a man who can't stand up to anything. I wonder, is that what you've become? I dropped my eyes. What I'm asking from you is to grant an old man his dying wish, he said gravely. He had gambled with that comment, played his best card, or so I thought then. His words hung in limbo between us, but at least he'd known what to say. I was still searching for the right words, and I was the writer in the room. Finally, I settled for this. Maybe Baba was right. I'm sorry you think that, Amir. I couldn't look at him. And you don't? If I did, I would not have asked you to come here. I toyed with my wedding ring. You've always thought too highly of me, Rahim Khan. And you've always been far too hard on yourself. He hesitated. But there is something else, something you don't know. Please, Rahim Khan. Sanubar wasn't Ali's first wife. Now I looked up. He was married once before to a Hazara woman from the Jaghuri area. This was long before you were born. They were married for 3 years. What does this have to do with anything? She left him childless after 3 years and married a man in Khost. She bore him 3 daughters. That's what I'm trying to tell you. I began to see where he was going, but I didn't want to hear the rest of it. I had a good life in California, pretty Victorian home with a peaked roof, a good marriage, a promising writing career, in-laws who loved me. I didn't need any of this shit. Ali was a sterile, Rahim Khan said. No, he wasn't. He and Sanubar had Hassan, didn't they? They had Hassan. No, they didn't, Rahim Khan said. Yes, they did. No, they didn't, Amir. Then who? I think you know who. I felt like a man sliding down a steep cliff, clutching at shrubs and tangles of brambles and coming up empty-handed. The room was swooping up and down, swaying side to side. Did Hassan know? I said through lips that didn't feel like my own. Rahim Khan closed his eyes, shook his head. You bastards, I muttered. Stood up. You goddamn bastards, I screamed. All of you, you bunch of lying goddamn bastards. Please sit down, Rahim Khan said. How could you hide this from me, from him? I bellowed. Please think, Amirjan. It was a shameful situation. People would talk. All that a man had back then, all that he was his honor, his name. And if people talked, we couldn't tell anyone. Surely you can see that. He reached for me, but I shed his hand, headed for the door. Amirjan, please don't leave. I opened the door, turned to him. Why? What can you possibly say to me? I'm 38 years old and I've just found out my whole life was one big fucking lie. What can you possibly say to make things better? Nothing. Not a goddamn thing. And with that, I stormed out of the apartment. So much information in few pages. I had to fight back tears while reading the part where Hassan dies. We'll find out if Amir goes to Afghanistan in the next chapter. So make sure to like and subscribe until then.